A billionaire married his assistant for a deal, but her secret changed his life forever. Damian Black, a man whose name commands respect and fear in equal measure, stands at the top of his empire, a billionaire with an unshakable resolve. He built his fortune through sheer willpower, ruthlessness, and a relentless focus on success. Yet, despite the wealth, power, and accolades that surround him, there remains an emptiness within. Damian has never believed in love. To him, it is nothing more than a weakness, an obstacle that can undermine the foundation of everything he's worked for. Relationships have no place in his world, where everything operates on cold logic and self-interest. He has learned early in life that emotion is a liability, and in his heart, he harbors a belief that to love someone is to risk losing control, something he can never afford. His focus remains solely on expanding his business, climbing higher in the corporate world, and securing his legacy. The emptiness he feels is a price he's willing to pay for the power he commands, and yet, a part of him wonders if he will ever truly be fulfilled. But that sense of emotional emptiness begins to grow as the pressure from his family intensifies. His father, an aging patriarch whose vision for the family empire is unyielding, has issued an ultimatum. Damian must marry to secure the family's future. The Black family has always been known for their wealth, influence, and impeccable reputation, but that reputation is increasingly in jeopardy without the proper union. The family's social standing needs to be solidified, and his father makes it clear that it is Damian's responsibility to ensure that this happens. The idea of marriage, once a distant notion, now looms over him like an inescapable shadow. It is a deal, not a romance, a transaction, not a partnership. Damian feels trapped in his own life, torn between his loyalty to his father and his desire for independence. Every fiber of his being resists the pressure, yet he knows there is no escaping it. His father's words, cold and calculated, continue to echo in his mind, and the idea of securing his legacy through marriage seems inevitable. Damian understands the stakes, but it does little to ease the resentment building inside him. Sophia Miller, Damian's assistant, is the woman who will become the center of this strategic move. To the outside world, Sophia is the epitome of efficiency and competence. She runs Damian's life with remarkable precision, ensuring the smooth operation of his day-to-day affairs. Her professionalism is unrivaled, and it is this quiet strength that has made her indispensable to him. To Damian, she is an asset, one whose talents allow him to focus on the broader scope of his business empire without the distraction of the mundane. But beneath her composed exterior, there is a quiet complexity. Sophia is not just a worker, an assistant, or a cog in Damian's machine. She, too, carries her own weight, her own pain, hidden from the world. Her personal history, one of deep emotional scars, has shaped her into the woman she is today. Though fiercely independent, she is also incredibly guarded, unwilling to allow anyone close enough to see the true depth of her vulnerabilities. For Sophia, the thought of being with someone, of allowing herself to love and be loved, seems impossible. She built walls around her heart long ago, walls that are impenetrable to all but herself. She's learned to keep her personal life locked away, far from the gaze of those around her, especially Damian. Sophia's hidden past is one that she has kept buried deep inside, a past that is filled with trauma and unresolved pain from relationships that have left their mark. The scars are not just emotional. They are a part of who she is, defining how she interacts with the world. Relationships have taught her to be cautious, to withhold, and to never trust. She fears vulnerability more than anything else, and this fear has led her to build emotional walls that no one has ever been able to breach. Even in her professional life, she is careful not to let anyone get too close, especially Damian. She understands the boundaries of their relationship and keeps things strictly professional, never allowing herself to entertain the idea of something more. But as time passes, the attraction between them becomes undeniable. It's subtle at first, a glance that lingers too long, a moment of shared understanding, but neither acknowledges it. Sophia, in particular, is too guarded, too focused on maintaining control over her emotions. She keeps her distance, believing that to entertain anything beyond professional respect would only open herself to further hurt. Damien, on the other hand, is aware of the attraction but refuses to acknowledge it. His proposal to Sophia comes not out of a desire for love or companionship, but from the need to fulfill his father's demands. To him, it is a simple business arrangement, a contract, a formality that will satisfy the pressures of legacy while providing Sophia with job security. He doesn't see this as an opportunity for romance. It's purely transactional. The arrangement will protect her, and in return, he will secure his family's name. It is a deal, no more, no less. When he proposes a marriage contract to Sophia, it is without emotion, without passion. His words are cold, detached, and pragmatic. He offers no warmth, no promise of anything beyond the logistics of the union. Sophia, despite her reservations, agrees. It is a reluctant decision, born not from affection, but from necessity. She has no other viable option. The contract offers stability, and in a world where stability is a luxury, it is something she cannot afford to pass up. Though the idea of marrying Damien, a man she has always kept at arm's length, unsettles her, she acknowledges that it is the only realistic choice. There is no room for love, no room for emotion in this equation, only cold logic and survival. As they finalize the terms of the agreement, there is a tension in the air that neither of them can ignore. The marriage contract is explicit. No emotional expectations, no intimacy, no affection. It is a purely business-focused arrangement. Damien is clear in his intentions, making it known that this is not about romance. For him, this is merely a solution to a problem. For Sophia, it is an opportunity to secure her future. The tension between the cold, businesslike nature of the agreement and the unspoken emotional complexity of their situation is palpable. The undercurrent of chemistry between them is undeniable, but neither of them dares to acknowledge it. The contract is sealed, and they both move forward, knowing that this arrangement will alter the course of their lives in ways neither can predict. As the days progress, Damien and Sophia settle into the routine dictated by their arrangement, yet the emotional undercurrents between them only deepen. While Damien is consumed with the logistics of the marriage and securing the future of his family's empire, he can't shake the growing awareness of Sophia's presence. She's no longer just his assistant. Something more complicated brews between them. In the quiet moments, when their eyes meet across a crowded room or their conversations linger a moment too long, he feels the undeniable pull. But Damien, ever the stoic businessman, locks these feelings away, refusing to let them interfere with his plans. He tells himself it's irrelevant. This marriage is a means to an end, a way to appease his father, not a relationship based on affection. But deep down, as the days turn into weeks, he starts questioning if this arrangement will truly remain as emotionless as he intended. Can he keep pushing away the feelings that Sophia inadvertently stirs within him? And if he can't, what does that mean for the life he's carefully constructed? Sophia, too, begins to feel the weight of the unspoken tension between them. Though she tries to maintain the distance she's always kept between herself and Damien, the proximity they now share brings an intimacy she hadn't anticipated. It's not romantic, at least not in a way she once feared. It's something more subtle, something that demands she reconsider everything she once thought she knew about her emotional boundaries. At first, she continues to remind herself that this is a business arrangement, nothing more. But the longer she spends in Damien's presence, the harder it becomes to deny the pull between them. Still, she refuses to entertain the possibility of love. Her past has made it impossible for her to trust in that kind of connection. The walls she's built around her heart have stood strong for years, and she's convinced that to let them down now would be to open herself to pain once again. Despite their mutual reservations, the stakes of their arrangement continue to rise. As Damien and Sophia navigate their new lives, walking a fine line between business partners and something else entirely, The tension between their professional roles and personal emotions begins to build. Neither of them is truly prepared for the emotional consequences of their decisions. Sophia, though she's agreed to the arrangement out of necessity, begins to feel the weight of what she's given up in order to secure a future she never envisioned. The contract she signed with Damien is no longer just about security. It's about a partnership that neither of them knows how to navigate. She feels vulnerable in ways she never anticipated. Her independence, the thing that has always protected her, seems to slip further from her grasp with each passing day. For Damien, the decision to marry Sophia, though pragmatic, starts to feel more like a burden than a solution. As he watches her from across the room, watching how she handles their business with precision, how she moves with quiet strength, he realizes how much he's underestimated her. There's more to Sophia than he ever gave her credit for. His initial view of her as a mere employee, someone who fits into his grand plans, starts to falter as he witnesses the quiet resilience within her. She's not just a woman bound by her own trauma. She's someone who has fought to maintain her sense of self in a world that has often sought to break her. Her ability to move forward despite her past both intrigues and unnerves him. Yet, as much as he admires her strength, Damien can't help but feel threatened by it. It's easy for him to remain detached, to treat their relationship as a transaction, but Sophia's presence challenges that detachment. She forces him to confront emotions he's long suppressed. In a world where vulnerability has no place, the emotions she awakens in him are disorienting. It's easier to push her away, to keep their connection strictly professional. But with each passing day, he finds it harder to maintain the distance between them. Every fleeting moment, every touch that brushes too closely, every conversation that veers into territory neither of them is prepared for, chips away at the cold walls he spent years constructing around his heart. Their arrangement, meant to be a simple solution to a complex problem, becomes something neither of them could have predicted. As the days wear on, both Damien and Sophia find themselves facing emotions they never thought would come into play. Though their marriage was meant to be a cold, calculated move, the emotional complexity of their situation starts to take on a life of its own. Neither of them can ignore the undercurrent of attraction that seems to linger between them, even though neither is ready to acknowledge it fully. The contract, the cold logic that governs their relationship, has become increasingly difficult to maintain. The emotional tension that simmers just below the surface begins to spill over into the cracks of their interactions. Neither of them is able to avoid the inevitable collision of their emotional lives with the practical reality of their marriage. The barriers they've each built to protect themselves begin to erode, piece by piece, leaving them both exposed. They begin to realize that the arrangement, designed to protect them both from emotional entanglement, is doing the opposite. As they move forward with the marriage, there is no going back. The emotional complexity of their situation has already begun to shift the foundations of their carefully crafted lives. Though neither is ready to admit it, both Damien and Sophia are on the cusp of a transformation they never anticipated. Their arrangement, once merely a matter of business, is starting to look more like the beginning of something far more profound. Neither of them knows exactly what that something is, but they both feel it. A shift, a change, a subtle unraveling of everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. And so, as the days continue to pass, both Damien and Sophia face an uncertain future. Though the marriage is based on cold logic, neither can deny the growing complexity of their emotions. The future is unknown, and yet, in the quiet moments they share, they both realize that their lives are forever altered. The marriage, which once seemed like an answer to their problems, now seems like the beginning of an entirely new set of challenges. And in this uncertainty, a new chapter begins. One neither of them is truly prepared for, but one they will face together. Damien found himself increasingly drawn to Sophia in ways he hadn't anticipated. It started subtly, an awareness of her presence that lingered even outside of the office. He would find excuses to be around her, lingering longer than necessary after meetings, seeking her advice on matters that didn't require her expertise, and often making sure she was included in events that had little to do with work. It wasn't just her professionalism that caught his attention, though it was impossible not to admire how seamlessly she ran his world, but the quiet strength she exuded. There was something in the way she carried herself, in the way she moved through life with a calm resilience that fascinated him. It stirred something deep inside him, something he quickly learned to suppress. Damien had spent his life building an empire, one that had no room for distractions, especially those born from emotions. Yet, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the pull toward her became undeniable. Sophia, on the other hand, was beginning to feel the weight of the expectations placed on her more heavily as the wedding approached. The closer the day drew, the more suffocating the thought of stepping into the public eye as Damien's wife became. She had always been comfortable in the shadows, in the role of the behind-the-scenes orchestrator. But now, with the wedding looming, she would be thrust into a world where every detail of their marriage, of her life, would be scrutinized. The pressure to appear perfect, to maintain the illusion of a flawless partnership, felt like an impossible task. She had always been good at keeping up appearances, but this was different. This wasn't just about business meetings or the occasional dinner with colleagues. This was about an image, one that would follow her everywhere, and the thought of living under that constant gaze began to unravel her calm exterior. She started questioning whether she could really go through with it, whether she could uphold the facade of a perfect marriage, one that was built on an agreement rather than genuine affection. As if to further complicate matters, a chance encounter with someone from her past brought back memories she had long buried. The brief interaction left her rattled, her composed demeanor slipping as old emotions surfaced. Anger, anxiety, and vulnerability all churned within her as she tried to regain control. But the cracks were beginning to show. Damien noticed. For the first time, he saw through the polished, professional image she had so carefully crafted. Something flickered in her eyes, a moment of rawness that he hadn't expected, and it piqued his curiosity. He was intrigued, but more than that, he felt a growing sense of responsibility. He couldn't understand why she was so guarded, so emotionally distant, but he wanted to. The business side of their relationship was clear, cold, calculated, and efficient, but there was something deeper, something that tugged at him, something that made him question his own feelings. The harder he tried to ignore it, the more intense his desire to uncover the truth about her became. Sophia, meanwhile, was struggling to make sense of her own emotions. Her attraction to Damien was undeniable, but it terrified her. She had spent so many years protecting herself, building walls to keep others at a distance. She'd never allowed herself to be vulnerable with anyone, and the idea of doing so with Damien, the man she now found herself growing closer to, felt like a dangerous risk. She feared that opening up to him would make her vulnerable to rejection or worse, manipulation. The stakes were too high. Their marriage, though pragmatic, was not an emotionally safe space. It was a business deal, a contract with no room for love. Yet, despite her fears, she found herself torn between the desire to connect with him and the instinct to protect herself from the pain of exposure. Damien, too, was caught in his own web of conflicting emotions. He had always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, his emotions, and his business. He had no use for vulnerability, had no time for love. It was a weakness, a distraction. But as he watched Sophia from across the room, as he listened to her soft-spoken words and noticed the quiet strength in her every move, he felt something stir within him. He began to wonder if his long-held beliefs about emotions were wrong. Perhaps there was more to this woman than he had initially allowed himself to believe. But even as he felt drawn to her, a part of him resisted. He feared that allowing emotions into the equation would undermine everything he had worked for, especially the power he had so carefully cultivated. The growing attraction he felt for her, though undeniable, felt like a betrayal of everything he had built. Yet, the more he tried to shut it down, the harder it became to deny it. Both Damien and Sophia began to feel the emotional distance between them growing ever more precarious, but neither was willing to acknowledge it. There was a chemistry, an unspoken tension that simmered just beneath the surface of their interactions, yet they each clung to the boundaries they had set for themselves. Their marriage was a business arrangement, one they had both agreed to out of necessity, not love. It was clear to both of them that to cross the line into something more personal would complicate everything. They tried to keep their relationship within the confines of the deal, but the emotional currents they were both struggling to suppress made it increasingly difficult. Neither of them was ready to admit the truth of what was happening between them, but deep down, they both knew that things could not stay as they were forever. The lines between business and personal, between control and vulnerability, were blurring, and neither of them knew what would happen if they crossed them. The unspoken tension between them grew, becoming almost palpable. Despite the growing attraction and the emotional complexity of their situation, both Damien and Sophia remained silent. They were not yet ready to confront the reality of what was unfolding. Instead, they continued to navigate their relationship as they had before, carefully, with a sense of distance, but always aware of the storm quietly gathering between them. Both of them were at a crossroads, each facing a choice they weren't yet prepared to make. The tension was at its peak, the calm before the storm, and neither of them knew that the next step would change everything. The tension between Damien and Sophia continued to simmer, each of them acutely aware of the emotional complexities at play, but unwilling to confront them head-on. Sophia felt the growing strain in their relationship, a conflict between her desire to protect herself and her dawning need to trust Damien. But every instinct she had honed over years of emotional survival screamed at her to keep her distance, to keep her secrets locked away, hidden from the man she had now become increasingly close to. She had never been one to share her vulnerabilities, not with anyone, not even with those who might seem safe, like Damien. Yet, something about the way he was beginning to act, about the way he had begun to linger in her presence, made her question if she was wrong to think that love could be kept at arm's length. The anxiety that came with the realization unsettled her further, and she often found herself retreating into her own thoughts, battling the pull she felt toward him and the walls she had so carefully constructed. Damien, too, was facing his own internal conflict. Despite the rigid control he had always exerted over his emotions, he could feel the cracks starting to form. He couldn't help but notice how his thoughts would drift to Sophia, especially in the quiet moments when his mind was free of distractions. His fascination with her strength and grace was undeniable, but what troubled him more was a growing awareness of her vulnerabilities. For the first time in his life, he found himself wondering if there was more to power than money and control. It was unsettling, to say the least. He had never been one to indulge in sentimental thoughts, yet here he was, struggling with feelings that, until now, he had considered a weakness. He wanted to know the reasons behind her guarded demeanor, to understand what had shaped her into the woman she had become. But as much as his curiosity gnawed at him, he feared what he might uncover. As his curiosity gnawed at him, he feared what he might uncover. What if his actions, his intrusion into her past, could unravel the very foundation of the marriage they were about to formalize? What if exposing her wounds, even with the best of intentions, would only deepen the divide between them? As the days went on, the emotional distance between them became more pronounced, not out of hostility, but out of the unspoken fear each had of what the other represented. Sophia, despite her deepening feelings for Damien, felt the weight of her own emotional scars that she wasn't ready to let anyone, especially Damien, see. She had spent too many years learning how to hide the remnants of her past, too many years convincing herself that she didn't need anyone. The idea of trusting Damien, of opening up to him in ways she had never done with anyone else, was terrifying. Yet, it also stirred something within her, a longing for a kind of intimacy she had once thought was impossible for someone like her. It made her question whether she could ever allow herself to be vulnerable, even with a man who had, at least in her eyes, shown a modicum of kindness, albeit veiled in the cold practicality of their arrangement. For Damien, the internal battle raged just as fiercely. The reality of their situation, two people bound together by a contract rather than love, was becoming harder to ignore. He had long prided himself on his ability to control everything in his life. But now, in the quiet moments when he allowed himself to reflect, he began to realize that there was a part of him, a part he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge, that wanted something more than just business from Sophia. He wanted to protect her, to ease the pain that he could feel seeping beneath her composed surface. He had never seen her so vulnerable, so exposed in that fleeting moment when her emotions had slipped out of her control, and it shook him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He was drawn to her strength, but he was also beginning to recognize the fragility that lay hidden beneath it. This duality of strength and vulnerability, so starkly present in her, was beginning to chip away at the icy walls he had built around his heart. But neither of them was ready to face the truth of what was happening between them. They continued to move through the motions of their arrangement, keeping their distance, maintaining the illusion of control. Every glance that lingered, every unspoken word that passed between them, only added to the growing storm that neither dared acknowledge. Neither Damien nor Sophia was prepared to make the first move, to break the silent agreement they had made to keep their emotions at bay. They were both caught in a web of uncertainty, unwilling to give in to the desires and fears that haunted them both. The underlying storm that brewed between them reached a breaking point as the days passed. Sophia could feel the pressure building inside her, the weight of her fear of exposure threatening to overwhelm her. She was on the edge of something she didn't fully understand, but she could feel it coming, a shift in their dynamic that would change everything. Damien, too, began to sense that the calm they had been maintaining was an illusion, a fragile veneer that was about to crack. He wasn't sure how long he could keep pretending that everything was fine, that their relationship was as simple as the contract they had signed. The unspoken tension had reached its peak, and neither of them was ready for the consequences of what would come next. As they both stood at the precipice of an emotional breakthrough they couldn't yet fully grasp, the stage was set for everything to shift. The quiet storm that had been brewing was about to break, but neither of them knew how or when it would happen. The tension, thick and heavy, marked the beginning of a transformation neither could avoid forever. Damien sat in his study, staring at the papers on his desk, but seeing nothing. The wedding was only days away, yet all he could focus on was Sophia. He had spent years building an empire where emotions played no part, and now, as he prepared for the most public of commitments, he found himself battling an entirely new kind of powerlessness. The attraction he had tried to suppress had only grown stronger, and despite his best efforts, he found himself longing for Sophia in a way he had never longed for anyone. His mind kept returning to her, to the moments when they had shared more than just professional glances, the way her presence had slowly begun to unravel him. He tried to dismiss the feelings as a temporary lapse, a distraction, but deep down, he feared that his growing feelings for her would ruin everything. He had made this deal for security, for control, and now it was slipping through his fingers. If he gave in to his emotions, would he lose the power that had been the core of his life? Was his need for her worth the risk? Sophia, on the other hand, was acutely aware of the rising tension. Every moment spent with Damien, every glance that lingered a little too long, only reminded her of the deepening pull she felt toward him. But as much as she tried to ignore it, to keep her focus on the practicalities of their upcoming wedding, she couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in her chest. She was preparing to become Damien's wife in front of the world, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the mask she had so carefully crafted was beginning to crack. The emotional distance she had worked so hard to maintain was becoming harder to uphold, and the fear of vulnerability threatened to swallow her whole. She had built her life around control, around keeping her emotions locked away from others. But now, facing the reality of her upcoming public life, she couldn't escape the truth that the facade they were presenting was barely holding together. The growing connection between her and Damien felt like a breaking point, and she wondered if she was ready to face what that meant for her future. Then everything shifted in an instant. During the wedding rehearsal, Elliot's unexpected arrival shattered the fragile atmosphere. His presence was like a storm in a calm sky, and Sophia's breath caught in her throat the moment she saw him. She hadn't seen him in years, and for good reason. Elliot was a painful part of her past, one that she had buried deep inside her, far from her new life. But here he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes locked on her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. She knew the moment he stepped into the room that he wasn't there for pleasantries. His presence disrupted everything: her composure, her carefully curated life, and her marriage to Damien. Elliot had always been unpredictable, volatile even, and she knew the storm he carried with him was about to break wide open. The tension in the room grew, thick and suffocating, as everyone else watched the interaction unfold. Sophia could feel all eyes on her, and her heart began to race. Elliot's accusations were like a blade, cutting through the air, sharp and unforgiving. He didn't hold back, confronting her with bitterness and rage. His words hit like punches, each one more damaging than the last. He spoke of their past in front of everyone, of the betrayal, of the manipulation, of the abuse she had suffered. He didn't care about the setting, the people around him, or the consequences. He was there to hurt her, and he did. He called her a liar, a manipulator, accusing her of hiding their history to deceive Damien, to deceive everyone. The room fell into stunned silence as the brutal truth of Sophia's past was laid bare for all to see. Damien stood frozen, shock radiating through him as he processed the words, the accusations. He couldn't believe it. The woman he had been working with, the woman he had chosen to marry, was not who he thought she was. How could he have missed it? How could he have been so blind? Sophia's world collapsed around her as Elliot's words tore into her, forcing her to confront the darkest parts of her past. Her emotions, long buried under layers of self-control, began to unravel. The pain, the fear, the shame, all of it came flooding back, and she couldn't stop it. She had spent so long building walls to protect herself, but now they were crumbling. She couldn't keep the tears from spilling over, couldn't keep her hands from shaking. The world around her blurred, and the weight of her past seemed to swallow her whole. She pulled away, retreating inward, trying desperately to find some semblance of control, but it was slipping further from her grasp. Damien had never seen her like this, vulnerable, broken, and it terrified him. His mind raced with questions. What was the truth? Had she been deceiving him this entire time? Was everything they had built based on lies? Sophia's retreat was almost immediate. She shut herself off from Damien, emotionally withdrawing into herself as she struggled to process everything that had just been exposed. She couldn't bear to face him, couldn't bear the thought of him looking at her with disgust or pity. The distance between them widened, each step she took back from him further deepening the chasm of uncertainty. Damien stood frozen, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. He didn't know what to do, how to respond. He wanted to reach out to her, to offer some form of comfort, but the anger and betrayal swirling inside him made it impossible. How could she have kept this from him? How could she have hidden something so significant? He couldn't reconcile the image of the composed, professional assistant he had worked with for so long with the broken woman before him, and it unnerved him in ways he couldn't explain. He wanted to protect her, to fix this, but the weight of the truth was too heavy, and the fear of being dragged into the emotional mess of her past threatened to pull him under. He was lost in a sea of conflicting emotions. Protect her or push her away. Let her in or shut her out. His heart was torn between his growing feelings for her and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. Could he still stand by her after all this? Would he even be able to understand her past, let alone accept it? The revelation of Sophia's past lingered in the air like a heavy fog, clouding everything around them. Damien felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The world he had carefully constructed, where he was in control of every situation, now felt unstable. How could he reconcile the cold, calculating businessman he had always been with the man who was beginning to care for Sophia, deeply and undeniably? The rules he had lived by, rules that had kept him safe, in control, and invulnerable, no longer seemed to apply. The truth of Sophia's past, her trauma, complicated everything. He didn't know if he could bear the weight of it, if he could truly accept everything that came with her history. And yet, Some part of him wanted to reach out, to understand her pain, and offer a space for healing. But how could he, when he wasn't sure he could even trust her anymore? How could he allow himself to be vulnerable with someone who had hidden so much from him? The turmoil inside him was suffocating, and the more he tried to push it away, the stronger it became. Sophia, for her part, had no answers either. She was drowning in her own confusion and guilt, unsure of what to do with the feelings Damien's unexpected presence stirred in her. Her heart had already been battered by years of emotional scars, and now, after everything that had happened with Elliot, she felt as though she was back to square one, isolated, unworthy of love, and completely alone. She had never planned to let Damien in, never intended for this marriage of convenience to become anything more. But somehow, over the course of their arrangement, she had started to care for him, to feel something real that she had not felt for anyone in years. The idea of him rejecting her because of her past was a thought she couldn't bear. She feared that if he truly understood everything, he would walk away. And maybe, in some twisted way, that was what she deserved. She had never given anyone the chance to truly love her, because she had never believed she was worthy of that kind of love. The emotional distance between them grew with each passing day, a wall that neither was willing to break down. Damien tried to bury his conflicting emotions under layers of cold logic, while Sophia retreated further into herself, locking away the parts of her she feared would drive him away. But the tension between them remained palpable. Every interaction, every glance, every word felt loaded with unspoken meaning. The quiet storm of their emotions built, and neither of them knew how to confront it. They were both trapped in the web they had woven, and the more they tried to distance themselves, the more tightly it seemed to pull them together. Sophia's internal conflict was a constant battle between her desire to protect herself and her growing need for Damien. She couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement, this marriage, was spiraling into something far more complicated than she had ever imagined. It wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was becoming something else, something she wasn't sure she was prepared for. The fear of opening up, of being vulnerable, weighed heavily on her, but so did the fear of losing Damien. She had never been in a relationship where trust was built, where the emotional scars of the past were accepted and healed. She wondered if she could ever let go of the fears that had held her captive for so long, and if Damien could be the person to help her do that. Damien, on the other hand, found himself at a crossroads. The realization that his feelings for Sophia went beyond the business arrangement was undeniable. He had tried to push it aside, telling himself that it was simply a passing infatuation, but deep down he knew it was more. The problem was, he didn't know how to navigate these emotions. The idea of love, of genuine connection, had always seemed weak to him. It was an unnecessary complication that only led to disappointment and betrayal. But now, as he watched Sophia struggle with her own past, he couldn't help but feel a protective instinct toward her. The woman he had once seen as just a business partner was now someone he couldn't imagine his life without. But that realization came with its own set of complications. If he allowed himself to care for her, could he maintain control over his life and his empire? Would he be able to reconcile the man he had always been with the man he was becoming? The idea of stepping into emotional territory with her both thrilled and terrified him. He didn't want to be vulnerable, but the more he tried to keep his distance, the more it felt impossible. And then there was a question of their marriage. What had begun as a cold, logical agreement was now anything but. The deal was no longer just a contract. It was a tangled web of emotions, past trauma, and unspoken desires. The line between business and personal had blurred, and Damien could no longer ignore the emotional complexities that had taken root in their relationship. The more he tried to push them aside, the more they seemed to demand his attention. He couldn't pretend anymore that everything was fine. The weight of what had been exposed, what had been revealed in that public confrontation, was too heavy to ignore. As the tension between them reached its peak, they found themselves standing on the edge of something they both feared, something that could either break them apart or bring them closer together. But the question remained, Could they ever truly let go of the past enough to build something real? Could they bridge the gap between the emotional scars they both carried and create a future where love was not a weakness, but a strength? Neither knew the answer, but they both knew that something had shifted irreparably. And now, it was a question of whether they were strong enough to navigate the storm that was coming, or whether it would tear them apart forever. Damien sat in the quiet of his office, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic storm of confusion and emotion. The weight of the past few weeks pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. Sophia's past, her trauma, had shattered the illusion he had carefully built around their marriage. What had once been a business transaction, a logical arrangement to secure his future, had now become something far more complex. He couldn't deny it any longer. He was no longer just her husband for the sake of convenience. His feelings for Sophia had evolved, shifted into something deeper, something that frightened him. He had always prided himself on control, on the ability to navigate any situation with calculated precision. But now, as he faced the turmoil in his heart, he wasn't sure what to do. Was it his duty to help her? Was it just his desire to fix what was broken inside her? His mind screamed at him to pull away, to maintain the distance that had always defined his relationships. But his heart, still unprepared for this kind of emotional vulnerability, urged him to draw closer, to fight for her. The conflict within him was maddening. Could he allow himself to be this emotionally involved with her? Or would he lose everything he had worked so hard to build? Sophia, meanwhile, was retreating further into herself. The revelation of her past had shaken her to her core, and the walls she had so carefully built around herself were crumbling. She had always prided herself on being strong, on appearing in control, but now, after Elliot's public confrontation, she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced in years. She had never allowed anyone to see the truth of who she was, someone broken, scarred, and unworthy of love. Now, with the secret of her past out in the open, she was certain that no one, not even Damien, could ever accept her fully. Her shame was suffocating, and she pushed Damien away with every ounce of strength she had left. She couldn't bear the thought of him seeing her for what she truly was, damaged, flawed, and irrevocably changed. The facade she had maintained for so long began to crumble under the weight of her guilt. And yet, despite her resistance, a small part of her longed for the very thing she feared, someone to love her, scars and all. But that was a vulnerability she couldn't afford, not with the stakes so high, not with the possibility of losing herself again. So, she pushed him away, believing that it was the only way to protect herself from the pain that seemed inevitable. Damien, however, refused to give up. He could see the emotional distance in Sophia, could feel the walls she had put up between them, but he wasn't willing to let her shut him out entirely. Something in him shifted. He could no longer ignore the reality that their marriage was no longer just a transaction, no longer just a way to secure his future. It had become something more, something he couldn't explain. He had started to care for Sophia in a way he hadn't expected. And so, despite her coldness, despite her attempts to push him away, Damien kept showing up. He offered her small gestures of support, words of understanding, always careful not to push too hard. He knew that she was afraid of being vulnerable, but he refused to give up on her. He had never been one to wear his heart on his sleeve, but for her, he was willing to try. Every time she withdrew, he pressed on, determined to show her that his care for her was genuine, that he was there for more than just a business arrangement. He didn't know how to break through her defenses, but he was willing to try. His internal struggle grew stronger with each passing day, torn between his desire to help her heal and his fear of losing control over his own emotions. Could he really let go of the control he had so carefully cultivated, or would his heart be broken in the process? Sophia, though, was resolute in her resistance. She couldn't allow herself to believe in Damien's kindness. She couldn't allow herself to believe in anyone's kindness, not after everything she had been through. She had convinced herself that her past was something that could never be accepted, that her scars were too deep, too damaging. And yet, Damien's unwavering support began to chip away at the walls she had built. Each gesture, each word of reassurance, made her question everything she had believed about herself. She had spent so long keeping people at arm's length, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that she was strong enough on her own. But Damien's quiet persistence made her feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. It terrified her. Every part of her screamed at her to keep her distance, to protect herself from the inevitable hurt that would come from allowing him in. But the more he reached out, the more she felt herself being drawn to him, despite herself. It was a battle between what she wanted and what she feared, and she was losing that battle. Damien, for his part, had his own emotional walls to confront. He had built his life on control, on power, on the ability to manipulate every situation to his advantage. But as he watched Sophia struggle, as he saw the way her past haunted her, he realized that the walls he had built around his own heart were just as strong as hers. He had spent so long burying his own emotions, afraid that any sign of vulnerability would weaken him, would expose him to pain. But now, with Sophia's emotional walls so evident, he understood that he couldn't help her if he didn't allow himself to be vulnerable too. In a rare moment of intimacy, Damien broke down. He admitted his own fears, his own insecurities to Sophia, sharing with her the scars from his past that he had always hidden away. The act of opening up shocked him, but it also shocked Sophia. She had never seen him like this, so raw, so human. It was a turning point for both of them. For the first time, Damien realized that he didn't have to be perfect, that he didn't have to have all the answers. And for Sophia, it was the first time she saw Damien as more than just a business partner. He wasn't just a cold, calculating man who had married her for convenience. He was someone capable of deep emotional connection, someone who understood pain. Their relationship began to shift, slowly at first, as they both started to tear down the walls they had built around themselves. Sophia, despite her fears, began to trust Damien again. She opened up about the depths of her trauma, about the things she had never told anyone. Their conversations grew more honest, more raw, and in those moments, they found something real between them. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was progress. Damien no longer saw her as a business partner, someone to fulfill a contract. He saw her as a woman deserving of love and healing, a woman who had been through more than anyone should have to endure. And Sophia, for the first time in a long time, began to see Damien in a new light, not just as a man bound by his business, but as a man who genuinely cared for her. As the days passed, their connection deepened. What had once been a mere transaction between them had slowly evolved into something far more complicated and meaningful. They were no longer just partners in a business arrangement, but two people learning to trust and care for each other beyond the confines of the deal that had initially brought them together. The emotional walls they had both so carefully constructed began to crumble, but the road to healing was not a smooth one. There were moments when they faltered, when old fears resurfaced, but each time they came together, they learned something new about each other and themselves. Sophia began to let go of her guardedness, piece by piece. She found herself sharing things with Damien that she had never shared with anyone. Her fears, her trauma, and the overwhelming sense of unworthiness that had plagued her for so long. It wasn't easy. Each time she spoke, she feared that Damien would see her as broken, as something unworthy of love. But to her surprise, he listened. He didn't judge. He didn't pull away. Instead, he offered her the support she had been so afraid to ask for. Damien's presence, his unwavering support, became a source of strength for Sophia. It was as though, for the first time, she wasn't alone in her pain. And in that shared vulnerability, something beautiful began to grow, a connection that was built on trust, honesty, and mutual understanding. For Damien, the process was just as challenging. He had spent his entire life avoiding vulnerability, keeping his emotions locked away in an attempt to maintain control. But now, with Sophia, he realized that control was no longer enough. He couldn't protect her from her past, and he couldn't protect himself from his own emotions. For For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to feel deeply, to feel the pain of his past, the fear of losing someone he was coming to care for, and the hope that they could find a way forward together. It wasn't easy for him to open up, but he knew that if he truly wanted to help Sophia heal, he had to let down his guard. And in doing so, he found that his own wounds began to heal as well. The emotional breakthrough between them came one quiet evening when they were alone, sitting side by side in their living room, the weight of their past heavy in the air. Sophia had been reluctant to talk about the darkest parts of her trauma, but as she looked at Damien, something inside her shifted. She took a deep breath, and for the first time, she spoke about the full extent of her pain, the abuse, the manipulation, and the betrayal that had shaped her view of the world. She was trembling as she spoke, the fear of being rejected overwhelming her. But Damien didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, taking her hand in his, offering her the comfort of his presence. He listened intently, his heart breaking for her, but he didn't judge. He didn't offer empty words of consolation. He simply held her hand and let her speak, letting her release the pain she had carried for so long. As she finished, silence hung in the air between them, a silence that was heavy but somehow comforting. It was then that Damien spoke, his voice soft but full of emotion. He told her that he understood, that he had his own scars, his own fears. He admitted that he was scared too, that he was scared of losing her, scared of what their relationship might mean for both of them. But in that moment, they both knew that they had reached a turning point. The bond between them had shifted from one of obligation to one of genuine care. Their connection was no longer about fulfilling a contract. It was about them, as two people trying to heal, trying to find something real in the midst of their brokenness. The days that followed were marked by small, quiet moments of progress. Damien and Sophia continued to navigate their evolving relationship, learning to trust each other more with every passing day. They weren't perfect, and their pasts were still a weight they carried, but they had started something new. They were no longer bound by the terms of a business arrangement. They were two people who had been through their own battles, and now they were fighting together, not just for the future of their marriage, but for each other. Slowly, their relationship shifted from one of transactional convenience to emotional companionship. They began to see each other not just as partners in a business arrangement, but as individuals with hopes, dreams, and pain. They started to make plans for the future, not as a couple fulfilling an obligation, but as two people who wanted to build something meaningful together. The emotional intimacy that had once seemed so out of reach began to grow, and with it came a sense of hope. A hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal together. Sophia, still cautious, began to allow herself to dream of a future with Damien. She still struggled with her fear of vulnerability, but with every moment they shared, she grew more and more confident in the love and support Damien was offering her. She no longer saw herself as someone unworthy of love. She saw herself as someone deserving of happiness, and with Damien by her side, she began to believe that happiness was within reach. It was a slow process, but the healing had begun. For Damien, the realization that his marriage to Sophia was no longer just a business deal was both liberating and terrifying. He had built his life on control, on power, and on the belief that emotions were weaknesses. But with Sophia, he had learned that emotions weren't something to fear. They were something to embrace. He no longer saw their marriage as a transaction, but as the beginning of a partnership, one that could help them both heal and grow. He still had his doubts, still feared the emotional complexities that came with their bond. But for the first time, he allowed himself to feel hopeful about the future. With Sophia, he felt like he could have something real, something more than he had ever imagined. Together, they began to move forward, not as two people bound by a contract, but as two individuals learning to trust and love each other. The future was uncertain, and they still had much to work through, but they were no longer facing it alone. They had each other, and that, for the first time, felt like enough. As they stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next, they knew that their relationship, once defined by practicality and convenience, was now grounded in something far more meaningful, emotional connection, vulnerability, and love. And that was the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. One that neither of them could have predicted, but both were now willing to embrace. The shift in their dynamic was subtle at first, but over time, it became undeniable. Their relationship, which had been born from necessity and circumstance, had blossomed into something far more profound than either of them had anticipated. They had learned to navigate the complexities of their past and, in doing so, had found a deep emotional connection that transcended the transactional nature of their original agreement. Damien, once so focused on control and power, had learned to let go, even if only a little. He began to see Sophia not as a fragile woman who needed protecting, but as a partner, someone who was strong and resilient, capable of standing beside him not just in the boardroom, but in the quiet moments of vulnerability. He admired her more than he had ever imagined possible. Her strength, her ability to rise above her past, became a source of inspiration for him. And yet, beneath that strength, Damien could see the pain she still carried, the scars that hadn't yet healed. He wanted to be the one to help her heal, to be the one to give her the love she deserved. Sophia, on the other hand, found herself grappling with the changes in her own heart. She had always been guarded, always afraid to let anyone too close. But Damien had broken down her walls, not through force, but through patience and understanding. He had shown her that it was safe to trust, that she didn't have to carry her burdens alone. She had once feared that love would make her vulnerable to betrayal. But with Damien, she realized that love could be a source of strength, not weakness. She was learning to let go of her past, piece by piece, and embrace the possibility of a future with him. But as much as they had grown emotionally, there were still obstacles to overcome. The ghosts of their past lingered, reminding them of the scars they both carried. They had come so far, but the road to healing wasn't linear. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of their shared trauma threatened to pull them apart. But each time they faced these moments, they grew stronger. They learned that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about acknowledging it and moving forward together. Their relationship was no longer a business arrangement. It had become a partnership, grounded in mutual respect and love. They had discovered something more precious than anything they could have planned for, a connection that transcended the practicalities of life and reached into the depths of their hearts. They were no longer two people fulfilling a contract. They were two souls who had found solace in each other's presence. As time passed, they started to make plans for the future. They talked about children, about building a home together, about the life they wanted to create beyond the walls of their shared trauma. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, they were ready to face it as a team, united by their love and their shared commitment to each other. Sophia, once so closed off, now found herself thinking about the future with Damien in ways she never thought possible. She had come to realize that the love she had feared was exactly what she had needed all along. With Damien by her side, she felt a sense of security, not just in their marriage, but in herself. She no longer saw herself as someone defined by her past. She was someone who had the power to shape her own future, someone capable of love and deserving of it. For Damien, the realization that his relationship with Sophia had grown into something real and lasting was a revelation. He had come to see that love wasn't a liability. It was a gift. It was a force that had the power to heal, to transform, and to create something beautiful out of the ashes of their pasts. He no longer feared losing control, because he had learned that there was a different kind of strength in letting go. Together, they had created something that was uniquely theirs, something that wasn't bound by contracts or obligations, but by their shared commitment to each other. The journey they had been on had been anything but easy. It had been filled with heartache, betrayal, and moments of doubt. But through it all, they had found something greater than they had ever expected, a love that was born out of vulnerability, trust, and mutual respect. It was a love that had transformed them both, not just as individuals, but as partners as a couple. And as they faced the future together, they knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. Sophia and Damien had learned that love wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, about understanding, and about supporting each other through the storms. And in each other, they had found the strength to face whatever came next. With every step they took together, they knew that their bond was unbreakable, that their love was real, and that no matter what the future held, they would always have each other. And that, in the end, was all that truly mattered. Damien sat alone in the quiet of his office, the city lights twinkling outside the window. He had always been driven by ambition. His need for power, control, and success had defined him for as long as he could remember. But now, as he reflected on the journey he had taken with Sophia, he realized that everything had shifted. His ambitions, once so sharp and clear, had softened. They had been replaced with something far more profound: love. In the stillness of his reflection, he understood that his former drive for control had only been a barrier to the deeper, more fulfilling connections he had with others. Love, he now saw, was the truest strength of all. And in Sophia, he had found the most unexpected gift: vulnerability. Her willingness to open up, to shed the walls she had built around herself, had inspired him to do the same. Damien's heart had changed, softened by the raw, honest emotions he had experienced with her. It was no longer about being the man in control, but about sharing his heart with someone who could truly understand him. His once clear path to power seemed insignificant now, compared to the emotional growth he had undergone alongside Sophia. Sophia, too, had undergone a transformation. The woman who had once been weighed down by the scars of her past had found a new strength. She had faced the darkest parts of herself, the trauma, the fear, the shame, and had begun to release them. In the process, she had rediscovered who she truly was, someone capable of standing tall and proud, regardless of the shadows that once loomed over her. She no longer saw herself as a victim of her past. Instead, she was a woman who had emerged from those experiences stronger and more resilient. For the first time, she truly believed that she was worthy of love, that she didn't need to hide her past to be accepted. The weight of her previous shame had lifted, and in its place was a renewed sense of autonomy, a feeling of ownership over her life and her future. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the past would resurface, when the old fears would creep in, but with each passing day, Sophia grew stronger. And it was in her newfound strength that she realized something profound. She could now live not just for Damien, but for herself. As Damien and Sophia spent more time together, the relationship that had once been born out of necessity became something far deeper. Their bond, once transactional, had blossomed into something that was rich with love, trust, and mutual respect. It was no longer about fulfilling obligations or adhering to societal expectations. It was about the connection they had nurtured, the emotional intimacy they had cultivated. One evening, they sat together, reflecting on their journey, marveling at how far they had come. The distance that had once separated them had closed, and the walls they had each put up had crumbled. It wasn't just a love born out of convenience. It was something real, something unshakable. They had become partners in every sense of the word, supporting each other, growing together. Their bond had shifted from a business arrangement to a union grounded in emotional connection. But the challenges didn't end there. Damien knew that in order to fully embrace his love for Sophia, he would have to confront the expectations placed upon him by his family, his business associates, and society at large. The weight of those expectations had always driven him. But now he saw them for what they were, chains that kept him from living authentically. With newfound courage, Damien made a bold decision. He would no longer allow the world to dictate who he was or who he could love. He would stand by Sophia, proudly and publicly, no matter the consequences. Confronting his father and business partners, Damien declared his commitment to Sophia, refusing to let anyone tell him how to live his life. The resistance he faced was fierce. His father's disapproval was palpable, his associates wary of the decision. But Damien stood firm, realizing that true power didn't come from control or influence. It came from being true to himself and to the woman he loved. Sophia, too, had reached a pivotal moment in her journey. She had spent so long living in the shadows of Damien's world, defined by the trauma of her past and the expectations of those around her. But no longer, with Damien's unwavering support, she began to carve out a life of her own, one that was independent and full of possibility. She made the decision to step away from the confines of the world he had built and to pursue her own passions. It was a powerful declaration of her own worth, a recognition that her value didn't lie in being a reflection of someone else's life. She would live for herself now, free from the constraints of her past, embracing the future she had long been afraid to reach for. In making this choice, Sophia not only took control of her own destiny, but also empowered herself to fully engage in the love she had with Damien, no longer seeing herself as someone unworthy of his affection. Together, Damien and Sophia began to dream of a future that was theirs to create. They talked of building a life that reflected both of their aspirations, where their love would be the foundation for their shared endeavors. They saw a future where both of their strengths would combine, where they could thrive both as individuals and as a couple. No longer bound by the limitations of their pasts, they envisioned a future that was full of possibilities, where they could both be the best versions of themselves, supported by each other's love and commitment. In this newfound partnership, they no longer saw themselves as two separate people trying to navigate the world. They were united, their love serving as the strongest force that held them together. Sophia's journey of healing had also helped her come to terms with one of her greatest fears, the fear of rejection. She had spent so many years afraid that if she allowed herself to be loved, she would ultimately be abandoned. But with Damien, she began to understand that love didn't come with conditions or expectations. Damien's love was unconditional, and it had freed her from the lingering shadows of self-doubt. She no longer feared rejection, because she knew that she was worthy of the love she had with him. This realization deepened her commitment to him, not out of obligation, but out of genuine love and trust. For Damien, this love had brought about an evolution he never could have predicted. He had started out as a man who sought control, who defined his worth by power and influence. But through his relationship with Sophia, he had discovered that true fulfillment didn't come from power. It came from vulnerability, from sharing one's heart with someone else. He had shed the armor that had once defined him and allowed himself to be open to the kind of love that transformed him. Damien had learned that love was not a weakness. It was a strength. And it was through his love for Sophia that he had found his true purpose, not in wealth or power, but in the connection they shared. The couple decided to celebrate their love in a symbolic act of commitment. They exchanged personal vows, heartfelt and deeply meaningful, marking the official transition from a business arrangement to a loving partnership. The ceremony was intimate, surrounded by only those closest to them, as they vowed to stand by each other's side through every challenge, every triumph, and every moment of joy. This simple, powerful act was a testament to the emotional growth they had both undergone and the love they had built together. It was a moment of transformation, not just for their relationship, but for both of them as individuals. As they stood together, their vows sealed, they knew that they were no longer two people bound by a contract. They were a couple united by love, understanding, and respect. The future no longer seemed uncertain. It was full of promise. Together, they could face anything. The story that had begun with business and necessity had evolved into something much deeper, a love that had healed them both, that had made them stronger, and that would continue to shape their future. As they stepped into the future together, they knew that their journey was only just beginning. The past was behind them, and the possibilities of what they could achieve together were endless. They were no longer two people defined by their past. They were a couple, defined by the love they had cultivated and the future they would build together. This was their new beginning, and it was only the start of what promised to be a beautiful, shared life.